So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for being with us on such a late Friday afternoon. And definitely, let's speak the like the charms of the speaker and the research topic, right? And so we are very happy and honored to have Professor Hu Yang with us today. And so Professor Hu is a senior lecturer in sociology at Lancaster University. He has been taking on lots of administrative roles as well. He's a co-lead of the Resilient Cities cluster at the Future City Research Institute and the deputy lead of Data in Society at Data Science Institute. And so Professor Hu's research focuses on changing work, family, intimate, and gender relations and their intersections with the population mobility in a global context. And so he's on several editorial boards, and including Journal of Marriage, Family, Sociology, and Sociology Compass. Since the outbreak of the COVID-19, and Professor Hu has conducted very impactful research on the implications of the pandemic for social inequalities and people's well-being. And Professor Hu is a very prolific author. And so his work has appeared in many prestigious journals such as Gender and Society, Journal of Marriage and Family, Journal of Family Issues, Demographic Research, British Journal of Sociology, European Sociological Review, and on and on. And so without further ado, let's welcome Professor Hu, and he will speak how does age shape social interactions? And so logistic-wise, we'll still let Professor Hu to finish his presentation first. He said that he can finish actually within 35 minutes, but we'll still keep it between 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A that follows. And so for the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to tap in the chat box, or please just hold it until the Q&A. Okay, and so Professor Hu, please, now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jen, for your very generous introduction. And I'm delighted to join everyone today in sharing my research. Today, I'm going to talk about how does age shape our social interactions. The underpinning research for this presentation was published in European Sociological Review last year. And if you're interested in reading further about this piece of research, you can find it following the address on the screen. So before I go and share my research, I wanted us to participate in an interactive activity online together on Slido. If you have your phone right in front of you, can you just scan the barcode? And if you're using a browser, can you type in slido.com and then type in the session code CFPR? And then if you can please answer this question on whether how do you use age in your research, that will be appreciated. Do you use age as a key predictor? Or do you control for age in your research? Or do you use age for sample selection? Or do you have other usages? I'll give you about 20 seconds. And the responses are still coming in, so I'll just give you 10 more seconds before I move on. I can see that many of us control for age in our research, and some of us might use age for sample selection. For example, if we focus on older adults, younger people, we use age to filter people into our sample. Sometimes we use age as a key predictor. So thank you very much for all of your responses. I'm just going to quickly move on. And your responses certainly concur with my own experience. I quite often use age in my own research. That has motivated me to look into the topic issue today in the first place. If we look into the wide range of social science research, we see that age is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Quite often we control age in the background, but less likely we shine a spotlight on age in our research. And when age does take the center stage, quite often it's used as an individual attribute to demarcate between our different positions in the life course. Or when age is used in the collective, we quite often use age to demarcate between different generations and cohorts. In those usages, we quite often see how we use our own age to predict and understand how we ourselves behave or articulate our opinions. What about the age of other people in our social interactions? And how do the ages of other people shape how we behave, how we represent ourselves, and how we express our opinions? These somehow represents a substantive age gap in social science research, which I aimed to fill in the first instance. As it turns out, if we look into the social science literature, the age gap is not only substantive, but also methodological. Age is not an entire novelty in social science research. If we look into the survey methodological literature, we quite often see that scholars take survey interview as an epitome of social interactions. And in this particular literature, face-to-face interview has quite often been crowned as the queen of data collection. More specifically, researchers explored how gender shapes social interactions in survey interviews, as well as the role played by ethnicity and race in this process. If we look into the comprehensive review conducted by West and Blom in 2017, we start to realize that interviewer age effects represent some understudied areas. And for the limited range of studies that did focus on interviewer age effects, they tend to focus on a single context. Focusing on survey interview as an epitome of social interactions allows us to test some of the key theories underpinning our interpersonal interactions, such as social desirability, social attribution, social acquiescence. And essentially, it provides an ideal opportunity for us to understand how power operates in our interpersonal interactions, such as how power operates in a particular survey interview setting or in a broader social setting. And to understand how age shapes our social interactions, I use the illustrative case of gender attitudes, the way in which we express our gender attitudes. More specifically, I focused on people's articulation of attitudes towards the rights of women to paid jobs. Although this is the case in focus, I also tested a wider range of attitudes, how people express them, such as attitudes towards sexuality and homosexuality, women's housework and work-family roles. And the results I'm going to present in this particular presentation is also robust in some and many of those different areas. But why do we focus on the articulation of gender attitudes? The importance can be justified in at least 3 ways. First of all, we know that gender attitudes are substantively important. We know that such gender attitudes are not supposed to very accurately predict our behavior, but they do inform how we behave in society. When taken in the aggregate, we also know that in the populist regimes and politics that's becoming increasingly prevalent nowadays, policymakers do listen to public opinion in making their policies. Gender attitudes are very telling of what kind of gender equalities we can enjoy in society. It's also methodologically important. When we want to examine interviewer age effects, we want to examine something that's relevant and salient to the idea of age. Throughout the past several decades, alongside the gender revolution, we know that our gender attitudes changed quite a bit throughout history across different cohorts and generations. We also know that there are some life course dynamics as people navigate the events of marriage, parenthood, and their gender attitudes and ideologies tend to shift across the life course. So it's particularly relevant to the study of interviewer age effects. And there is also a third dimension of importance with regards to empirical feasibility and impact. Gender attitude measures are fielded in a wide range of national and international surveys. So by looking at this particular measure, we have the chance of reflecting on a wide range of data collection activities in the social sciences. So in order to understand how age shapes our social interactions, I theorize its role at two distinct levels. On the one hand, I focus on age as an individual attribute. So when we are looking at age, or the age of someone sitting right in front of us, we are not just isolating age as an individual attribute, we're also associating age with a wide range of stereotypes we hold about a given individual. According to the social attribution theory, we might stereotypically assign gender attitudes, for example, to a person of a given age. And as a result of this attribution, we package the gender attitudes and age together in terms of how we view this person sitting right in front of us. Once we have this stereotypical package, we start to think about how we respond to this individual. And according to social desirability theory, we tend to provide socially desirable responses we expect this person to hear from us. The social desirability is also bolstered in the interview setting by the higher power afforded to the interviewer, who's controlling the agenda of the survey interview. Given the social attribution and social desirability, we have our first hypothesis regarding direct interviewer age effects. We expect interviewer age to have a net impact on people's gender attitude reports. I deliberately left the direction of the effect open here because in just a moment, I'll be discussing how the direction may just vary across a wide range of normative contexts. And the story doesn't stop here. We know that when we are involved in social interactions, we strike a conversation with someone. Our own identity and age identity should matter as well. In this conversational process, we not only think about who the interviewer is, what kind of age identity they have, we also think about how we sense of our own age distance in relation to the interviewer. As a result of this sense-making of our age distance from the interviewer, we treat the conversation and interaction as a relational process for the negotiation of closeness. As we know that if there is a zero age distance we perceive that we have between us and the person we are conversing with, and there is no need for us to do the negotiation or modify our responses. But if there is a large difference, then we are expected to do something to bridge that distance. That leads us to our second hypothesis regarding relative interviewer age effects. That is, the direct interviewer age effects may be greater when our respondent interviewer age distance is wider rather than narrower. But we also expect our own age, to make a difference. In survey interviews, we know that older people's weaker cognitive functioning means that they have a greater sense of reliance on interviewers' assistance and guidance. By relying and depending on the interviewer, we also know that older people tend to relinquish part of their power to the interviewer. And in this process, we expect that older people may be more sensitive and susceptible to interviewer age effects. Those are some of the individual level expectations and theories underpinning our research. But the story goes further. As you can see in the red circle on the screen, we know that our individual interactions are further embedded in broader social contexts. And the normative context can matter because it informs the stereotypes about age and gender attitude link we assign to the interviewer. That may have an impact on how we perceive and relate to the direct interviewer age effect. We also know that normative context can shape how we make sense of and respond to the age difference we have in relation to the interviewer. For example, in societies where older people have greater authority, younger people might be obliged to bow into the power of older interviewer, and provide a socially desirable answer. But in a different kind of power structure, given the normative context, the power dynamics can pan out in a very different way. Two aspects are particularly relevant to our understanding of the age-gender nexus. On the one hand, according to life course theories and empirical research, we see the traditionalizing effect of some of the life course events, such as marriage and motherhood and parenthood and so on. On the other hand, in the collective, we also know that there is a substantial cohort and generational shift in people's gender attitudes alongside the gender revolution. That might differentiate how we assign different gender attitudes in a stereotypical way to older versus younger people. To capture this older-younger difference, I created this new concept called normative age distance, which is used to capture, conceptualize, and operationalize contextual norms regarding age differences in gender attitudes between older and younger people. And building on this concept, I proposed a few hypotheses. So how do we relate to the broader normative context in navigating how we respond to someone's age? If the context indeed forms a major source for us to understand what kind of labels and gender attitudes we should assign to a given age, then we would expect the context to play a validation role of our stereotypes. That's why in contexts where younger people hold more or less egalitarian gender attitudes than older people, we would accordingly expect one to report more or less gender egalitarian attitudes to younger rather than older interviewers. And we also expect normative context to validate and just tell us what kind of distance we should expect from the interviewer. That's why the wider the normative age distance and the greater interviewer age effects there might be. Furthermore, we would expect that older and younger people might relate to the interviewer's age and the context in different ways. On the one hand, we know that the older generations and people have had a fuller experience and knowledge of the generational and cohort shift and social changes. That's why they might be more aware and sensitive to those social changes. On the other hand, we also know that in youth studies, quite often we see young people cast older people's values quite often as outdated and less desirable. And as a result, they might be less likely to bow into the power and position of the older interviewers. If the power dynamics work in the other way around, if we expect in a society that older people hold greater power, then we might see the effects running in the other way around. But if it's running in this way, as shown on the screen, that older people have a fuller knowledge of the generational changes and younger people resist to bowing what they call outdated values and attitudes, we might expect our final hypothesis to hold. That is, older people are more sensitive to normative age distance than their younger counterparts when they respond to interviewers' age. So enough about the hypotheses. To test all of those hypotheses, I draw on the cross-national data from the European Social Survey from 2010 and 2016. The data covered 46 country years and 30 countries. Altogether, I analyzed just over 77,000 respondents aged 16 plus who were interviewed by just over 6,000 interviewers. What's particularly valuable about the European Social Survey data is that the survey used a face-to-face interview, giving us an opportunity to examine the face-to-face social interpersonal interaction in action. And at the same time, the European Social Survey released the publicly available data on the interviews and the interviewees, and as well as the interview situation that allowed us to examine the social interaction in action. And also all of the different rounds of the European Social Surveys I used collected consistent data on gender attitude measures. Although I focused on the European Social Survey, this analysis might have broader implications, as the survey mode face-to-face interview and the measures I used in my analysis are also used by a broader range of international surveys, ranging from the World Values Survey, European Values Survey, International Social Survey Program, DHS, EASS, and GSS, across a wide range of countries. And my dependent variable in this particular focal point focuses on gender attitudes towards women's rights to paid work. The survey asked the respondents the question, men should have more right to a job than women when jobs are scarce. And the respondents were invited to respond to this question and express how much they agree with or disagree with this statement. The responses were captured on a continuous scale, ranging from 1, strongly agree, that is less gender egalitarian, to 5, strongly disagree, more gender egalitarian. And the measure has been used in a wide range of international and national surveys. And the results I'm going to report is also robust to alternative coding of this continuous measure into binary or ordinal schemes. And also other measures I tested, attitudes towards housework, women's work family roles, and attitudes towards sexuality and homosexuality. I have 3 key predictors: respondents' age, ranging from 16 to 86, interviewers' age, ranging from 18 to 80. A third measure I have newly created is the country year normative age distance in gender attitudes. I followed 3 steps to create this measure. Firstly, I calculated the absolute slope for age in a weighted OLS regression predicting gender attitudes. And you can see the slopes for each country year on the graph in the right-hand side. And once we have the absolute slopes, we know they are extremely sensitive to the age distribution in every country year. They are also sensitive to the mean gender attitudes across those country years. That's why I then calculated the relative slope by dividing the absolute age slope by country year mean gender attitudes. And as the final step, I reversed the distribution so that a large positive value indicates that younger people have more gender egalitarian attitudes. That's the measure for country year normative age distance in gender attitudes. I controlled for a wide range of variables that might influence interpersonal interactions in the survey interview at the respondent, interviewer, interview, and country year levels. For respondents, I controlled for gender, education, marital status, how many children one has, whether one lives with one's children, work status, occupational status, whether one's mother worked when one was 14, and migration status, ethnicity, religiosity, and Schwartz human values, particularly in 2 domains, conservatism and self-transcendence, which are known to shape gender attitudes. And at the interviewer level, I controlled for interviewers' gender and their experience, how many interviews have they conducted before the current interview, whether the current interview has been reissued and reallocated to a different interviewer, the number of visits for an interview, and the interviewer's rating of the respondents' understanding, efforts, and reluctance in responding to the questions, as well as third-party interruption during the interview. And at the country year level, I controlled for female labor force participation. As you might have gathered from the way in which I introduced my control variables, I used multi-level modeling to do my data analysis to account for the hierarchical nature of the data with a particular Multiplex specification. The models contain 3 levels. The first level, respondents, and respondents are further nested within interviewers. That means one interviewer might have interviewed multiple respondents, and then they are further nested within country years. To use the Multiplex specification, I included country year means for the key individual level and interviewer level predictors. This specification introduces an essential partial fixed effects for the key predictors at the individual level and interviewer level to partially account for the non-random distribution of interviewers' age across the country years. And in fitting the multi-level models, I also used multi-level weights in a scaled way. And to further illustrate the impact of interviewer age effects, I also conducted a counterfactual simulation, which I will come to discuss in just a moment. Now, here are the results. First of all, let's have a look at the interviewer age profiles in the European Social Survey. In the top panel, it depicts the average age of the interviewers across the country years. As we can see in countries such as Croatia in 2010, the average age of the interviewers were around 28. At the other end of the spectrum, we have places like Denmark in 2010. The interviewers' average age in 2010 was well over 60 years of age. That's why we are seeing drastically varying interviewer age profiles across the country years. And at the bottom panel, we also see the uneven distribution of interviewer-respondent age pairings across the countries. In places like Denmark, less than 10% of the respondents were interviewed by someone older than themselves. As opposed to at the other end of the spectrum, we see that in Croatia in 2010, over 60% of the respondents were interviewed by someone older than themselves. So quite some variation across the different countries. And we also see a non-random sorting of the interviewers' age profiles, as well as interviewer-respondent age pairing across the distribution of normative age distance across the countries. We don't need to dive into the curvilinear details here, but what essentially the results here are telling us is that the distribution of the interviewer age and interviewer-respondent age pairing profiles are highly non-random across the countries. That necessitates the use of the Multiplex specification to introduce a partial fixed effects model into our analysis to provide an accurate estimation of the individual and interviewer level estimation of the age effects. Now, here are the hypotheses. When we look at the first hypothesis with regards to the direct interviewer age effect, it's not supported by the results. We see that interviewer's age on its own does not have an overall direct influence on respondents' gender attitude reports. It means that there is no absolute unconditional bowing into the power of the interviewer on the part of the respondents. Looking further into hypothesis number 2, relative interviewer age effects, we see that it's very much supported by the results. On the left-hand side, we see the predicted value of gender attitudes, and on the right-hand side, we see discrete marginal effects. The results show us that interviewer age effects vary with respondents' age. And we also see that older people are more susceptible to interviewer age effects. When interpreted in conjunction with the results from the previous slide, we see that interviewer age effects on gender attitudes are formed in an interactive and relational way. It takes the age of both the interviewer and the respondent to work together to generate the interviewer age effects. And moving further to contextual moderation, we see hypothesis number 3 is also supported, that interviewer age effects vary by the contextual normative age distance in gender attitudes. What we see here is that in country years where older or younger people have more egalitarian gender attitudes, accordingly, the respondents are seen to report more egalitarian gender attitudes to older or younger interviewers. So they are going very much along with the normative context in thinking about the interviewer sitting right in front of them. What we are also seeing here is that the magnitude of the normative age distance is seen to amplify the interviewer age effects. In country years where there is a larger normative age distance, we are also seeing a stronger interviewer age effects. What those results are showing us is a strong presence of the contextual normalization and validation of the individual level normative attributions when it comes to how we stereotypically link gender attitudes to people's age. The story goes on. When it comes to hypothesis number 4, we see that the contextual variation in how the normative age distance moderate individual level age effects also varies with respondents' age. More concretely, we see that older respondents are more likely than their younger counterparts to draw on normative context to respond to the interviewer's age. Taken together all of those results, we have the preliminary conclusion that interviewer age effects are subject to both respondents' age in a relational and interactive way, as well as normative age distance in a contextually embedded way. But how much does all of those results matter? That's why I calculated the substantial effective size in a standardized way to compare the effective size of interviewer age effects with some of those other predictors that are quite often known to play a strong role in shaping people's gender attitudes. So we are taking the hypothetical scenario of a normative age distance of minus 0.17 and a respondent aged 86 years of age. We see the effective size of one standard deviation change in interviewer age in this scenario is 0.1 roughly. It's greater than Schwartz's human value when it comes to conservatism, and it's greater than religiosity, occupational status, interviewers' gender, interview interruption, and respondents' understanding and even their reluctance to engage with the interview process. In sum, we say that the effective size of the interviewer age effects to be quite substantial, but that raises a further question for us to look into. So what? What does this mean for our use of interviewer age and our analysis of gender attitudes using cross-national and national survey data? We know that there is a myriad of ways in which we use gender attitudes in our own research, sometimes as a key predictor, sometimes as a control variable, and sometimes as the dependent variable. But two of the most common ways in which we use gender attitudes are to measure the cross-national differences as to which country is more gender egalitarian in attitudes and ideology, and which country is less egalitarian. Or else, we might use gender attitude measures to capture over time historical changes, the progress towards gender equality. So I have taken one of those scenarios to have conducted a simulation here. That is to capture the cross-national differences in gender attitudes. In this process, I created a counterfactual sample in which all of the respondents were interviewed by someone of a similar age, that is within 10 years of age difference, minus or plus, while keeping all of the other variables using entropy reweighting to have the same mean level variance as well as the skewness as the original European social survey sample. Then I compared the country means in gender attitudes between the original ESS sample as well as the counterfactual sample. And here are the results that are presented on the screen. We see that compared with the current existing ESS data, the counterfactual sample in which all of the respondents were interviewed by someone of a similar age produced statistically different results for 9 out of the 30 countries. And in 4 of those 30 countries, the ESS data produced more egalitarian gender attitudes than it would have been if all of the respondents were interviewed by someone of a similar age. And in 5 of those 30 countries, the ESS data produced less egalitarian gender attitudes than it would have been if all of the respondents were interviewed by someone of a similar age. So we do say that interviewer age effects makes a substantive difference to how we might be able to interpret cross-national differences when it comes to gender attitudes. Finally, just to very quickly sum up the theoretical and empirical discussions I have presented just now, the results have at least 3 broad group implications. First, with regards to how age shapes our social interactions, we see that age is more than just a control variable we quite often use in social science research, given its substantial role in shaping the way in which we relate to and articulate our attitudes and opinions and interact with each other. And age works as both an individual attribute as well as a social context in shaping how we relate to one another. But more specifically, substantively, if we think about cohort and social change and the ways in which we articulate our attitudes, quite often in existing research, we take those cohort and generational changes as an aggregate of individual attitudes, adding them together to see how, at a collective level, they have shifted across different cohorts and over time. But what my findings has shown is that those cohort changes and generational changes, in the other way around, they also form the normative context to shape how individuals articulate their attitudes in the first place and how we have collected those data to be aggregated in the first place. When it comes to data collection in social science research, the results encourage us to rethink about whether face-to-face interview is still supposed to be crowned as the queen of data collection. When it comes to interviewer allocation, how do we allocate and match the age of the interviewers and the respondents? Of course, that might be infeasible, might be very difficult to achieve in thinking about how we match the interviewer and respondent age. That's why after the data has been collected, it's very useful for data collectors to also release data on interviewer age, as well as other related salient traits. And for us using and analyzing the data, it might be useful for us to start to think about controlling for interviewers' age and other salient traits in our analysis. Finally, we know that survey interview is just an epitome, an example to illustrate the broader interpersonal interactions. We also use interview face-to-face interaction in a wider range of data collection activities, such as qualitative interviews and other forms of face-to-face interactions. So the results also encourage us to think about how interpersonal interactions predicated on age might reflexively shape the ways in which we collect and interpret and analyze and present our data. I'm going to stop here and thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to our discussion. Just in case you're interested, I also conducted a wide range of robustness checks, alternative dependent variables, model specifications, codings, and control variables to ensure the results I'm presenting are robust. Zipping up here and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Yang, for a very comprehensive and insightful research project. And also thank you very much for saving us the time for Q&A. And so now the floor is open for questions and comments from the audience. Hu Shu first.
Hi, Dr. Hu. Thank you so much for your presentation. Very interesting. I learned a lot. My question is maybe not directly related to the focus of your presentation, but I hope it's a relevant one. I'm curious. I'm really curious about the very wide, broad variation in interviewer age in the European social survey you have shown. Between, the average age range between 20-something until 60, over 60, right? It's a huge range. And I'm curious whether you might be able to comment on how these European social survey was conducted in each of the participating country. Asking this so I'm thinking about the Chinese General Social Survey and the CFPS. Usually Renda and Peking University, they hire university students as these field worker to interview respondents. And I think this has really increased the respondents' response rates among ordinary Chinese, since they are more welcoming, they are more open to answer questions. If the interviewer is like an elite student from the best universities in China, so if we investigate the same question using the CGSS, then the variation in interviewer age might be very limited, since the majority of them are just university students in their early 20s. So the wide variation in the European interviewer age is really very surprising. So I'm really curious about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. And that's a really interesting question. So in the European Social Survey, as far as I understand, they used a quite wide range of different channels to recruit interviewers. So not necessarily just the university students, as we can see, certainly people in their late 40s, 50s, and 60s, they are unlikely to be university students, although in some countries, university students are also mobilized. But before I briefly comment on how European Social Survey used and recruited interviewers, I wanted to first of all comment on the question about the usage of elite university students to do the survey. That might create, if we think about the power dynamics, some sort of unequal power dynamics in the interview. If we are thinking about the interviewers as authoritarian figures having authority in the interview, then it's really important for us to think about how much the interview is bowing into this kind of authority and power, the elite status boasted by the interviewers. That's just my quick comment on the use of the elite group to do the interview. Coming back to the European Social Survey, they did use survey companies, for example, agencies to facilitate the survey process. That's why there are professional people involved and who are adults, not necessarily students involved in this process. It does vary across different countries as to what kind of agencies they have used. European Social Survey did try very best to train all of the interviewers to have a standardized procedure. But that's why my research is particularly probably drawing attention to how we also need to think about across different countries. When we are mobilizing interviewers, we need to pay attention to their age profiles and how that might influence our responses. But even within some of those countries having a quite skewed age profile, if you just tap this histogram for those countries, we also do see some variations in there. Albeit skewed, you do see interviewers coming from different age groups across the demographics. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Senhu. Senhu, it's your turn. Senhu, are you there?
Hi, hello. Hi, yeah. Hi, Yang. Very nice to meet you. Hi. So first, thank you so much for your presentation. And so my question is about what are the implications for the survey collection about the gender attitudes, given that we find there might be some measurement errors about the gender attitudes, and I'm just thinking about whether there are some other measures to deal with the problem. For example, can we conduct some online survey, or there are some, for example, experimental methods to deal with this social desirability bias problem? So so I'm just thinking about whether there are some other measures.
Thank you very much, Senhu, for your question. So there might be different ways to mitigate this. The level of difficulty can vary across those different ways in which we want to mitigate this. And they also have other secondary rippling implications moving on from there. So if we think through the survey pipeline, then we might start to think about survey mode, whether we want to use mixed mode survey, but that has implication for response rate and engagement and other issues. And then if we do stick with in-person interview, then we need to start to think about age matching. But that, as I just briefly mentioned, it can be very difficult depending on what kind of agencies we are mobilizing and what channels through which we are recruiting our interviewers. So that boils down, if failing that, we need to be thinking about, as data analysts, how do we control for interviewer age? How do we make this data generation process transparent so that we can really engage with what is going on? So I think the two crunch points from my findings, as it seems to me, is on the one hand about data collection, but on the other hand about the more substantive story about what type of interactions we have with regards to age will shape the kind of responses we get. It's not just about gender. It has to do with about anything that might have experienced a life course shift, or that might have experienced a generational shift, such as attitudes towards sexuality, right? We have seen quite a bit alongside the sexual revolution. So whenever we are measuring and thinking about studying those issues, we probably need to be age sensitive. Being age sensitive means we need to understand how age shapes the dynamics of our interpersonal interactions. So thank you very much for your question, Senhu. I hope I managed to respond to your question.
So actually, I also find that if we, for example, control for age or do some age matching, then we can have a better understanding of the gender attitudes only from the comparative perspective. But if you want to know the absolute measure of age, absolute measure of gender attitudes, and then what can we do?
Well, I guess one part of the question I'm raising through my findings is that, is there really an absolute gender attitudes? If we have to articulate our attitudes in a relational and interactive way, then it always will need to be interpreted in the interactive and relational setting. So maybe at the fundament of my presentation, I'm questioning that there is an absolute gender attitudes that we can articulate without any external influence from the interviewers. So that means when we're analyzing data, we also need to be, as quantitative researchers, be a little bit reflexive in how the data has been generated and what these measurements might mean for our understanding of the measurements. But of course, we still need to measure them. That's why we do our best to mitigate some of the interviewer effects. But then we start to think about and discuss in which direction the results might be skewed. And through simulation, we are able to some extent, measure to what extent has a given result being skewed towards a given direction. Then we can have greater confidence in the conclusions we are drawing from our research.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Sun-Hu. And Adam, you're the next. Hi.
Hello, Dr. Hu. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think this is a very interesting study, and I think all the findings and implications are all very important. And maybe I missed something in the presentation, or maybe I got the idea wrong, but I think the last part of your study is that you want to assume some counterfactual scenarios, that what if the respondents were interviewed by interviewers who are at similar age, right? And I couldn't get it fully, so I would like you to elaborate a little bit more, because if you assume in this way, wouldn't it be, also inducing some bias? Because now if I am a respondent, if I assume I'm young and I am extremely conservative, so if I am interviewed by another young researchers and I don't want to look back, I don't want to be looked too conservative, so I may want to report more liberal attitudes, right? So actually, I agree with you that we have to understand the concept as a relational concept, not absolute standard. But in the study, when we assume the counterfactual scenarios, it's still the same, because it may underestimate the conservatism among the young researchers, right? And it blew my mind, because it is, as a quantitative researchers, what we have is to rely on the answers, right? And it makes it so difficult and to really get without any bias if this is really what we find in the study. So I would like to hear more about what you think. What are the next steps? Because even we control for the interviewer age, and then we still cannot get completely bias-free conclusions, right? So what's your view on that? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. And that's an important one. I agree with the point that any counterfactual analysis will be limited to a given scenario. It will introduce other dimensions of bias. So in the counterfactual analysis, I only provided one of the many possibilities just to elaborate on what if we standardized the interviewer age selection, what will happen to the data collection. This is not to say that we are trying to eliminate the bias, but rather to give you one scenario. We can set it to be everybody's interviewed by someone older, set it to be everybody's interviewed by someone younger. So in this process, we can never truly, totally, that's very similar to my response to Sun-Hu's question. That is, we cannot possibly just eliminate the kind of bias. But by controlling the sort of experimental counterfactual scenario, that gives us an inroad into testing different scenarios we are interested in. So the assumption underpinning my scenario was that what if we carried out a procedure to standardize the selection of interviewers across different countries. But for some other researchers, one might be interested in the aging population. Then you're particularly interested in what if an older adult is interviewed by someone of a similar age or younger people, then we might be able to control the experimental condition or simulation condition for that particular demographic to see what the impact might be. So I guess what I did is more to elaborate a methodological approach in terms of how we can use interviewer age to think about the particular demographic we are interested in studying. And I'm encouraging us to think about using age, just our own age, respondent's age, as just a control variable. We need to think about the interviewer's age. I think for any kind of research, if we are serious about measurement that's so susceptible to cohort and generational changes in life course dynamics, it will be interesting for us to at least test how the interviewer might have influenced the results for a given demographic we are interested in, and then factor that into our research in discussing our results. So I'm afraid I'm not providing a perfect solution to the problem of eliminating bias, because it depends on what research question is, what bias means in the particular context of our research. But thank you very much for your question.
Our next question from Vincent. Vincent.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Thanks, Prof. Hu. I thought it was a fascinating presentation. So congratulations for such great work. My question, I suppose, you know, the theorist that comes to mind is Patricia Hill Collins, who talks about intersectionality. And I suppose the assumption made in this project is somehow that age is the most important attribute, you know, for the respondent, for the interviewer, and so on. But you know, when a person knocks on the door and says, "I want to interview you," the person comes as a package of age, gender, and race. And you talked about elite and so on just now. I suppose you could try to control for the gender and the age of the interviewer and so on, but that would be going against your view, which is to take a relational and intersectional view of identities and not to just control for age or to control for something else, you know, as if they were isolated, you know. So my question is you know, is there, have you predetermined that age somehow is the factor here, and how can we incorporate a more intersectional view of identities for such an endeavor? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vincent, for your question. That's really an important question. So I'm going to answer that question in two ways. The first way is from a conceptual and theoretical perspective with regards to predetermination. I wanted to bring age to focus to our attention. That was the purpose of this study. Interviewer age, gender effects and racial effects, they have been relatively more widely studied. So I wanted to bring age to focus. That's from a conceptual perspective. But from an intersectional empirical perspective, I did test in my additional tests the intersectionality with gender, for example, which I didn't present in the main findings in the presentation, but if you read the article, it was included in the supplementary materials. An interesting finding there is that when people are responding to someone's age in the interview, it's very interesting that the female gender tends to amplify that effect just a little bit, somewhat. Not a lot, but just a little bit. So we are seeing some intersectional effects coming out from my analysis. So definitely for future research that are truly really wanting to understand the full panoramic picture of interviewer effects, then intersectional approach is critical. But what I'm bringing to focus here is the importance that we need to pay attention to age. Quite often the categories of gender, class, status, they have taken the prime spots in social science research, but age is always lurching in the background, but never taking the spotlight.
I agree with you. Yeah, I do agree with you, because as you've said just now, when it comes to changing norms and so on, these are changes over time. So it is particularly the dimension of age that one has to study, in order to capture these over time changes. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
So on that note, I just want to quickly differentiate between using a respondent's own age in our own research or use age in an interactive way, because that makes a difference to the results as well. So quite often we only control for the respondent's age, even if we are studying cohort and generational changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Yang. I would just have like a very quick question. And so regarding your level 3 measure, now you use the female labor force participation. So I understand your conceptualization behind this, but as basically argued in this, how the gender revolution has been stalled. And so these measures in the public spheres may not reflect the actual levels of gender inequality, and this particularly not so relevant to European context. But for example, in Asia, right, we were seeing female labor force participation has been very high, but actually the actual division of labor within the family has been very unequal. It's still like very gendered pattern. And so regarding that, I'm especially given that the institutional backgrounds in Europe is still quite diverse, right? And some North European countries provides more like longer paternity leave and more comprehensive paternal packages, but in South European countries it is less so. And so I don't know to what extent this is irrelevant to your the context you are focusing on, but I want to hear about your thoughts on this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jen. That's really a good question. We know that the gender revolution is uneven and stalled in some areas. So I've tested a wide range of contextual measures to control for in my research. And labor force participation was one of them, which I used in the end. But if we use other more comprehensive measures, such as Gender Inequality Index and the World Economic Forum Gender Empowerment Index, that takes into account parental leave, that takes into account domestic division of labor, leadership positions, political participation, and so on, to capture the comprehensive environment, that hardly makes any difference to the kind of results I'm seeing from the interviewer age effects. I agree that when it comes to other areas of study, those comprehensive measures might be important. The rationale behind my choice of measure was because my dependent variable particularly focused on women's labor force participation versus that of men. So I wanted to choose a measure that's particularly relevant to that measurement. That is not to say all of the different dimensions you just mentioned are not important. They are very important. That's why I did test a wide range of other variables. Unfortunately, we know that in multi-level modeling, we only have 46 country year units, and the statistical power at that level can be quite limited. So I didn't really include a wide range of higher level variables all at the same time in the model to avoid risking underpowering my higher level analysis, but I did swap in and out other contextual variables in my analysis.
Thank you, Yang. So any other questions or comments? We probably
can I ask one? So I also remember that for some of the surveys that gender attitudes were measured in a self-completion mode, and and also during the COVID time, and many surveys were conducted online. So I'm just wondering whether do you think will this make any difference to measures of gender attitudes?
That's really interesting because we know the pandemic has placed a particular strain on the modes of data collection. Well, we have seen even European social survey recently moved online to have moved into the self-completion mode. that could have made a difference to the data. I will be interested in testing out the very recent rounds of the European Social Survey data to see how it might, in some ways, vary from the previous waves on the same measures. That might be an interesting topic to look into. But I'm also equally appreciating the fact that they didn't move online before the pandemic as an opportunity for us to observe interpersonal interactions, because we know that interpersonal interactions in action are extremely difficult to observe. How do we capture it and where do we capture it? And the survey interview really provided an opportunity for us to look into, have a glimpse into such interaction, although in a quite restricted way. It's not free interaction we have on a daily basis, but it's probably one of the best controlled conditions we can get on such a cross-national scale.
Thank you.
Thank you. I guess let's perfectly conclude our today's seminar, and let's put our hands together to thank Professor Hu for an exciting sharing of projects. Thank you so much. And before we call it day, I have an announcement. And so for next week, the CFPR seminar will be happening on Friday at 10 a.m. It will by Professor Song Zhen from School of Social Work at the University of Texas at Arlington on older adults' vulnerability and resilience to disasters. Okay, and now thank you, Professor Hu, and thank you everyone for sharing a very fruitful Friday evening, and have a good weekend, everyone.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for your participation.
Okay,
have a good
you.
weekend.
Yeah, thank you very much.